One of the really important things that kids need to learn to do in order to read between the lines or in order to understand the nuances of linguistic information is to be able to put themselves in the perspective of another person. This is difficult for children to do because at the beginning of life they start out from a very egocentric point of view. For instance, young children playing hide and seek will often go stand in a corner and cover their eyes and assume that if they can't see you, you can't see them. Whatever perspective they have must be the perspective that everyone has. I have a funny story from my niece. This happened a while ago, but we were driving in the car, and she was very young, maybe 2.5 or so, and she squinted her eyes, and the lights, like the street lamps, would make a bright star pattern, and they would fan out and refract differently than when she opened her eyes wide, and the light just was a circular orb, just a round ball of light. She said to me, "Look what I can do to the lights," and squinted her eyes. Assuming, of course, that if she was seeing the lights in a different way, that she must be controlling the lights in some magical fashion for everybody else in the world too. That if she was seeing that I must be seeing the same thing. Children, in order to adopt another person's perspective, another point of view, have to be able to exert executive function. They have to be able to use their cognitive control. So on page 435, we see that as we read in chapter 8, that children struggle with this a great deal, and in order to really put themselves in the perspective of somebody else, they have to inhibit their own perspective first. So in order to see what I'm seeing, they have to realize that what they're seeing is not the same. And they're just really bad at inhibition until about the age of 5 or 6 or so. And so these things are difficult for them. But they can do it about the age of 3 or 4. And the kinds of studies that have been done to suggest that, the reason why we know that they can put themselves in the perspective of somebody else, are studies like this. The false belief test is commonly known as the Smarties task. It's like the researcher will present a box to the child, and commonly it's a kind of candy, like Smarties, but it doesn't always have to be. It could be a box that looks like Crayola crayons or something. And when the experimenter asks, "What do you think is in the box?" the child will say, "Smarties," or if it's a crayon box, "crayons." And when the experimenter opens the box, something different is inside, like candles might be inside the box. And the child is startled. It didn't expect, of course, to see candles in a box labeled crayons. But interestingly, when the experimenter asks, like, for instance, if an experimenter were to bring out a Snoopy doll from a closet and put it on the table, they might say, "Snoopy didn't see the box of candles, didn't see what was inside, because he was hidden in the closet at the time." If we ask Snoopy, "What will you think is in this box?" what do you think Snoopy will say? And the child invariably, at the age of 3, it invariably will say, Snoopy will think that there's candles in the box. Of course Snoopy wouldn't think that, because it's a crayon box. It deserves to have crayons in it. But once the child has a different perspective, it assumes that everyone will have the same perspective that it has. Now, this isn't presented in the text, but recently a research study came out by Dr. Rubio Fernandez and Dr. I can't say the name, Guertz, I guess, something like that. It's entitled "How to Pass the False Belief Task Before Your 4th Birthday." And this task is similar to the Smarties task, wherein only about 23% of kids can pass that task when they're 3 years old. But when the researchers designed the task a little bit differently, they call it the Duplo's task. 80% of 3-year-olds can do this task, and essentially all they've done is made the task a little bit easier. They use some little Lego people to walk around in a little Lego house, and the Lego person puts some bananas in the fridge, and then later on another Duplo person comes into the room, and the experimenter asks, there's a first Lego person, I think, that sees that puts the bananas in the cupboard, and then somebody else comes in later and moves the bananas from the cupboard to the refrigerator, and then the first Duplo's person comes back, and the experimenter asks the child, where will this person think the bananas are? And the children are able to recognize that that Duplo's person would still think the bananas are in the cupboard. So if we make the task a little bit easier, less abstract, these kids can pass it about the age of 3, but they still can't do it earlier than that. There's another task called the referential communication task. It's described in the methods box 11.1 on page 432. And this task is just to have a bunch of objects on the table. And if there's more than one of a type of object, then in order for the child to communicate clearly about that thing, as you can see, for instance, in figure 11.3, there's a kid and an experimenter sitting at the table, but for that kid to talk about the ball, it has to clarify that it means the red striped ball and not the blue and white dotted ball. So it would have to say something about the ball in order for the experimenter to understand what the child was talking about. So we use the child's understanding of references about an object to know whether that child is putting itself in the perspective of the experimenter, or if the child is just assuming that what it knows, everybody else knows. Another task that's often used to understand the mind-reading abilities of young children is the one depicted in 11.4. It's also a referential communication task, but this one here has certain objects on a shelf, and some of them are blocked from the experimenter's view with backs of the shelf, as you can see. If a child talks about the big glass of milk, then the child is not taking into account the fact that the experimenter can't see the small one. So that would suggest that the child hasn't yet developed this theory of mind, or the ability for them to put themselves in the perspective of a different person. But those are some of the tasks that we use to understand their abilities to mind read, and essentially we see that at the age of between 3 and 4 years old, that children can pass most of these tasks really well. As I mentioned before, one of the things that this depends on is cognitive control, but that can't be the only one, because cognitive control doesn't develop until a little bit later than theory of mind develops. So one of the other things that... sorry, give me a second here. In box 11.2, we read about one of the other things that may be influencing the development of mind-reading abilities, or this theory of mind. Here we see that it's possible and even probable that by developing language abilities, that develops in turn the ability to put yourself in somebody else's perspective. The evidence that suggests this may be the case is often dealing with individuals who are deaf. In the first example, we see that individuals who are deaf and raised by hearing adults are at a disadvantage in mind-reading abilities, or in theory of mind, compared to those deaf children who are raised by deaf parents. Now, most deaf children are raised by hearing parents. Only 10% of the time is a deaf child born to deaf parents. So what we see then is that these children who are not exposed to language until later in life, because, for instance, the parent doesn't recognize that the child is deaf, or the parent until the child is a little bit older, or the parent can't learn sign language fast enough to be able to teach the infant sign language when it's in a critical stage. So it's not exposed to pure language until later in its development, and that suggests that it's perhaps because of the lack of linguistic input that they're delayed in adopting a theory of mind. Another piece of evidence that suggests that this may be the case is dealing with the development of Nicaraguan Sign Language, which we saw detailed in Chapter 2. These individuals were in the original cohort, in the first group of older students. These kids didn't have the ability to take the perspective of another person. But the younger students with more developed language did have that ability. So that points to the fact that maybe this linguistic input is having an effect on mind reading abilities. But the other piece of evidence that's even stronger is that when these kids came back for a second follow-up study, the older kids were able to oftentimes perform better on the mind reading tasks that I just described. The fascinating part about that is that there's a statistical relationship in that second study between the ability to learn so what they found was that those who acquired new language skills could pass the false belief task. But some of those people who passed the false belief task didn't necessarily learn new language skills. So what this is suggesting is that statistically we can parse out what the variance is due to, and we can say that the ability that the new language learning accounted for variance in the ability to pass the false belief task, or in these mind reading abilities. So, but it doesn't work the other way around. And because it doesn't work the other way around, it suggests that language can predict mind reading, but mind reading can't predict language. So that suggests that these two things are co-occurring, but that one may be causing the other, and it's not that mind reading is predicting language. It's really that by learning language, we develop the ability over time to be able to put ourselves in the perspective of other people.